I'm an intimacy and relationship coach and therapist. I specialize in working with individuals and couples to improve their overall life, particularly their intimate connection. Bridging that gap between each person's desire for frequency, but also their desire for how they want to express themselves sexually. I offer private sessions, like one-on-one sessions, but I also have a number of group classes and retreats that I offer, as well as couples intensives and retreats. My goal, I believe that sex is beautiful and people should love themselves by embracing their sexuality. So I'm really working to empower individuals and couples to develop more meaningful relationships and live more authentically together by helping them to set aside preconceived societal and environmental notions of how their sex and relationships should look like versus what they want it to look like. So basically, I just kind of give people permission to live their best desirable life overall, but particularly in their relationships.
How do you define sexuality?
Wow. So sexuality to me is like how you identify as a sexual being, how you want to express yourself sexually, and really how you allow yourself to express yourself in that sensual, sexual kind of way. So, like, a lot of people will identify sexual archetypes, right? Like they're the bad boy, or they're the vixen, or they're the sweet, the little girl, baby girl, daddy, goddess, god. There's all these different, sexual archetypes that people can kind of play with and role play into. So really your sexuality is just everything that makes you a sexual person, and how you choose to express that. It evolves. Like, people think that they're like stuck in one particular way of being sexually, but as open as your mind is, and as much as you want to give yourself permission to explore all aspects of sensuality and sexuality, right? Then you can really just have like a vast expression of your sexuality, all different kinds of degrees of it, right?
Absolutely. And it's interesting because you use the term how you allow yourself to express it and what you give yourself permission to do.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Those are sometimes two different things.
right. Talk to me about that.
A lot of people are doing what they think is expected of them sexually, or they're not giving themselves permission to explore aspects of their sexuality because they think it would be considered bad, right? So, like, there might be somebody who wants to engage in threesomes or BDSM or doggy style, even, or sex outside, or maybe they would want to wear sexy clothes, or they want to be more dominant, or they want to be more submissive, right? But they tell themselves, this is not okay for me to do. It's not okay for me to express myself that way. And so they don't give themselves permission to do it, right? And what they do allow themselves to do, typically what they allow themselves to do is what they think mainstream society, their parents, their church, their community would be okay with, right? So it's most people are only allowing themselves to do what they think other people are doing and what would be considered right, versus maybe what they want to be doing, because we have lots of fantasies. And while we don't necessarily want to role play or engage in every single fantasy that we have, the people that are really honest with themselves, they would engage in more fantasy play if they thought it was okay.
That's really interesting. Yeah, that is really interesting that you say that, because obviously on Live Jasmine, people many times come to explore their fantasies. And
Right.
many people have fantasies that, like you've mentioned, they might be afraid to share with a partner because It may
Mm-hmm.
not fall under the whatever society says is right, or maybe they have been rejected in the past. And so
Right.
Jasmine and I think that's one of the reasons campsites are really popular, honestly, is that it is a place where people know that more like most likely they're going to be accepted for their fantasy. They're allowed to talk about sex and they're able to explore themselves in that way. Do you feel like many people in today's society have even explored themselves sexually? Do they even know what their fantasies are?
Some people do, and some people don't. Um, in my experience, when asking women, like, what do you fantasize about? They often tell me that they don't fantasize at all. I think that women have a different definition of the word fantasy than what the majority of men have. But in truth, if you're even just thinking like, I really wish that my partner would come up from behind me and wrap his arms around me and kiss me on my neck while I'm making dinner. That is a form of fantasy, right? So it can be that mundane. Like statistically, I would say that it is a very, very small percentage of women, especially, that explore their fantasies. And men exploring their fantasies is significantly higher because more men will engage in like hiring prostitutes or going for an X-rated massage or using like webcams, or even just using like Pornhub or other like, porn devices that they have. So, it's more common for men to explore fantasy than women by far.
Why do you think that is?
Society has given more permission to men to be quote unquote men, right? To explore their sexuality, to have multiple partners. There's more approval for men cheating. There's more approval for men being rough with sex or for wanting or needing all of these different toys and scenarios, right? But women, we grow up with the message of be a good girl. Good girls don't act that way, right? You got to be prim and proper. Um, like I can remember being a little girl and spinning around and my mom telling me to stop seeking attention. I wasn't spinning because I was seeking attention. I was spinning because I was bored and I like to spin. Or like being a singer in the church and being told that I needed to learn to sing quieter because I was out singing, I was outshining other people, right? But do boys ever get told to stop outshining other people? Not very often, right? So we get different messages as, growing up as boys and girls. We just get different messages from our parents, from our churches, from our communities about what it means to be a boy or a girl, a woman or a man. And they're not directly telling us, like, you should not enjoy sex, you should not express yourself sexually, right? But because of all of the negative messages that we hear, either directly or indirectly, that's the assumption that most women come to. And what does everybody want? Everybody wants to be accepted and liked, right? And the number one fear in this world is being judged. And then there's also like that fear of if I do speak my truth about what I want sexually or how many partners I've had or what I've enjoyed sexually, it could be used against me. And I hear that from men and women. And unfortunately, it's true that sometimes it does get used against you in the relationship. I will not confess to anyone that I'm dating, if it's a new date, right? I won't confess to them that I've had a girlfriend or that I've ever had threesomes because immediately they stop seeing me as a potential partner, like in life, and they just start like, oh, so let's have sex with another woman. Let's have a threesome. When can we do this? Like, and I'm like, wait, hold on a minute. Like, I'm trying to get to know you, and I'm not even at that comfort level with you yet, right? Like, so, people tend to kind of hear what they want to hear, and then it's not only men, but a large number of men will kind of run with their own fantasies and try to make it the other person's fantasy as well, right? So a lot of women will deny having fantasies because there are a lot of men that when they hear the fantasy, I want to make this come true, right? Like, oh, that was sexy. That turned me on. Like, let's do this. And she's like, no, like just because I said it was a fantasy doesn't mean I actually want to do it, right? So even if they are having fantasies, a lot of times women will deny that they have them because unless it's something that she wants to engage in, she doesn't feel like it's safe to express it. And sometimes she's right and sometimes she's wrong. It really just depends on the person that she's dating, which is a lot of what I do with my work with people. Like people think that because I'm a sex therapist and coach that I'm only ever talking about sex, right? But most of what I'm doing is deconstructing the negative beliefs and scripts around sexuality and sexual expression, while also teaching people to have conscious action and language, which then decreases the conflict by improving their integrity of communication and agreements that they're making in their relationship. Because a lot of what I end up working with is like people have made agreements within their relationship that weren't true agreements. It was more like a person that had insecurities placed a bunch of rules on the other person. And because the other person wanted to be in that relationship, they agreed to those rules. But because those rules were not in alignment with who they were at their core, and because they were not being conscious about making the agreement, they end up breaking those agreements. And then they get labeled as like untrustworthy, cheaters, whatever, right? This catastrophic language is used. So a lot of my work is like teaching them to be honest about who they are, what they actually want, and making like full-hearted agreements that they can both live up to rather than having rules that are made from a place of fear and insecurity. That's like the cornerstone of what I do. Like we do all of that work before we go into like sexual exploration.
It's really interesting you bring that up because I think that is very common that people have either agreed to something that isn't in alignment with who they are, or there was never an agreement. There was only an assumption on someone's part.
Exactly. Yeah, that happens a lot too. This
That-
is my boundary, so it must be your boundary. No.
Just like assuming without the communication. And that's why, a lot of these kind of non-traditional relationships, either it be consensual non-monogamy between model and member on a site like Live Jasmine, these types of relationships, because they're not traditional, in order for it to work, there has to be really clear and explicit communication about what someone's looking for, what they're okay with, what they're not okay with. And you do see that in kind of more the non-traditional relationships, I think, than the very traditional relationships. There's a lot of assumptions that get made, and people get really hurt that way.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. I'm curious, in the couples that you see, do you see more couples or individuals?
It's about 50-50.
In the couples that you see, what would you say are some of the recurrent blocks to connection?
Broken trust, like resentment, is definitely one of them. People's own traumas that they had before they ever even got into that relationship. And because of those traumas, this lack of willingness to be vulnerable.
What does that show up as?
Oh, that shows up in a lot of different ways. It shows up with, not talking or speaking non-truths. It can show up with rigid, being rigid, right? Like, for example, like a man might want to go down on the woman and the woman won't let him. because she's not comfortable in her own body, right? And because she's not comfortable in her own body, she can't say yes to being vulnerable. Because think about it, like as a woman, if you're receiving oral sex, like you're spread out, right? It's one of the most vulnerable positions you can be in, right? They feel too seen. Like we as women, we want to be seen, but we don't want to be seen. We want to be able to be vulnerable, but we don't want to be vulnerable, right? So, not trusting myself and my own intuition makes it so that I can't trust the other person. So when you have an individual that has a lot of like insecurities or traumas, or maybe they've trusted someone in the past and that person broke their trust and now they haven't healed from that, but they're trying to be in a relationship that prevents them from being, fully open and vulnerable. I have a saying, speak your desire, not your complaint, because I'm a sex therapist, I'm a desire coach, I'm a tantra practitioner. And when I did the desire coaching with this company called One Taste, they would ask us multiple times a day, what is your desire? And honestly, I hated the question because I couldn't answer it. Like I could tell you what I didn't want, but I couldn't tell you what I did want. And now it's the cornerstone of my work with all of my clients, whether I'm working with a couple or an individual, because what I find is that, especially in this state, I don't know if it's nationwide, but in the state of Oklahoma, there's a lot of people complaining about what they don't want. And when I say, well, what do you desire? What do you want? They look at me like I've got 10 heads. They're like, well, I want him or her to stop doing this thing. And I'm like, okay, but what do you want? You're telling me what you don't want. Please tell me what you do want. So they have a really hard time answering that question. And I think that this is a big issue with human beings. This is part of what I meant by teaching conscious communication. Because if we don't consciously know what it is that we actually want from a partner or in a relationship, or what we want to feel and experience sexually, there's no way for us to communicate that to our partner, right? So then the partner is like fumbling, trying to give us what we want, and all they really know is what we don't want. And I don't remember who it was, but one of my teachers and mentors, whenever I was getting certified as a sex therapist, I remember one of them saying, just because they know what you don't want doesn't mean that they know what you do want, right? Like that's not really communicating to them how they can fulfill your desires. Having video calls or webcams, it's a safer way for people to explore what they do and don't want, right? Because like sexually, I can give clients a list of all of these different things, and they can go through and they can say yes, no, or maybe. And it might be something like blindfold or being tied down or being spanked or having sex in public or whatever. Well, if they've never experienced it, they're only hypothetically answering yes, no, or maybe, right? Because they've not actually experienced it. So they don't actually know how they would feel in that situation. It's just a hypothetical guess. But if you're using webcams with another person, you could, to some degrees, explore those areas, right? You could put on a mask over your eyes and let the other person direct you around and see what that felt like to you, right? But it's safe because you're safely in your own home and they're on the computer wherever they are, right? So the webcams actually give people the ability to try out a lot of different ways of being, whether it's role play, sex toys, sexual positions, what have you, without any kind of fear of like physical discomfort or the lack of physical safety, right? And like even for myself, like I've never used webcams, but for the last year and a half, I've been in a long distance relationship with a man that I met one weekend in Florida. And we use video call a lot. And before meeting him, I was the kind of person that was like, masturbation is useful, but it's overrated in my book, right? Like I could never have the kind of orgasm in masturbation as I could have if I'm surrendering to another person, right? But having this long distance relationship, we use webcams a lot. And so we're doing mutual masturbation frequently. And I actually found that I could feel his energy through the cam, right? I felt more connected to him. We can do eye gazing exercises. We can do breath work with each other. We can meditate together. We can masturbate together. And actually we get off at the same time every time, even though it's through video, because we can somewhat, be connected and feel each other. And before him, I was like, there's no way. There's no way. Like that couldn't possibly happen, But if we go several days without having a video call, I feel really disconnected and uneasy in my own body, right? And sometimes we can just get on the phone and we don't even really talk. We just look at each other. It's just eye gazing. I have learned because of this relationship and using the video cams, I've learned how to be able to receive exquisite attention on me. Where as women, we want to have exquisite attention placed upon us. We want to be seen and accepted as our full selves. But in reality, we have a hard time allowing ourselves to receive it because it feels uncomfortable. It feels vulnerable, right? So I've actually learned how to be able to receive it because of the video cams.
That is really interesting. And what's interesting about that is, yeah, I think this phenomena exists with a lot of people because as you're easing yourself into the comfort of being vulnerable, there's a safety that comes with, for some reason, the inherent distance.
Exactly.
A phone and video camera. That I'm finding in all of these interviews. I've interviewed hundreds of Jasmine models, members, and I'm finding that this inherent distance, it's a little bit of a gap.
Right.
It makes someone feel a little bit more safe because it's a little bit more controlled.
Right.
And for people who are uncomfortable initially with vulnerability, it's almost like easing you in.
Right. Exactly.
And people open up a little bit more than what they would sometimes in person. And
right.
I've interviewed members who have said they feel safe, right? But especially in the case of you're dealing with a model, a professional, members have said that they've learned so much about women and how to please a woman, because they're kind of being coached and taught and they feel receptive to getting the information that way. But to your point, there is just something about technology and the way it connects us in this very instant way that feels safe for some reason. I recently interviewed someone.
You could always just press end.
Yeah, exactly.
And just end the connection if you felt too uncomfortable, right?
Exactly. And I recently interviewed someone who is studying this topic, and he said a lot of, there's a school of thought that in-person connection is king. That is the most beneficial connection. That is the most, right? But he was saying he disagrees with that because he believes that it's not about how the connection is formed via in person or over the phone or the webcam. It's about the quality of the connection.
Right.
So if there's a stronger connection that's online, that actually is going to be more beneficial for someone than an in-person connection that's not as strong. So it's about quality, not where it takes place. And I find
I would agree with that. And I would also say, like, a myth about relationships is that the longer two people are together, the more comfortable that they will be with each other. Right? Like, I have people tell me all the time, like, oh, yeah, I knew he or she was disconnected and closed off and insecure, but I thought it would get better as our relationship, lasted, right? The longer we were in relationship, I thought that they would overcome that. My experience is the longer two people are in a relationship together, the more threat of losing that connection increases. And therefore, they actually shut down more. They become less secure because it's like, oh, well, if I speak my truth here, or if I express this thing about me and they don't like it, they might reject me. And when you're having a webcam situation, there's less of that. For whatever reason, there's just less of that. Like, I know for myself, like, I find myself being much more verbal and honest with my long distance boyfriend than I do with my local boyfriends, because there's zero threat. Like, I can just speak my truth, and if he gets upset, he gets upset. The phone, we just say goodbye, and then he calls me when he's not upset, or I call him when I'm not upset, right? But there's that automatic, like, okay, well, we both got uncomfortable. Bye. Right? There's that safety of just like pressing that button and disconnecting. And then hopefully you like work on yourself and like, why did I get upset? And what am I uncomfortable about? And can I express this to them? And, you want to come back and like repair that if you're in an actual relationship. But if you were engaging with, say, like a webcam model, you might not necessarily feel that you need to repair that because that was somebody that you were buying a service from, right? But you got to practice speaking your truth, regardless of how it made the other person uncomfortable or not, whether they wanted to hear it or not, right? And we all need to practice speaking our truths. If we could all practice speaking up, and likewise, if we could learn how to hear people's truth without taking it so personally, the world all around would be much better, I believe. Like,
Absolutely. And I think these online relationships are ways to kind of practice some of these skills. It's interesting too, because just like obviously, coming from Live Jasmine and looking at the models there, their soft skills, their communication skills are so phenomenal. I think that is part of why people are so drawn to them, because they are getting to practice. And these are these professionals who deal with many different types of people. I had one member tell me, he used to never ask out women on a date ever because he was too shy. And after having really or several positive experiences with models, now he feels confident enough to approach women because he's experienced the process a few times. So he had that.
that's great. People often think that confidence is supposed to be innate, and there are a few people that confidence is innate for. But my experience is that the majority of people who appear to be confident really worked at learning to appear confident, right? It's practice. Like, they've overcome their fears of speaking in public or asking somebody out, or whatever the case may be is, right? Like, people, like my clients, will often think that I am an extrovert, and I am a deeply introvert, like deeply, deeply introverted, right? But because I've practiced at teaching my classes, which are group classes, or doing my women's retreats, or I've now had a few experiences with public speaking for conferences and things, I've practiced it. So now it's easier for me, right? I've practiced, I've got positive feedback. So now I feel more confident in it, right? And webcams, they give people that practice.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's definitely what we've found to be true. Have you ever worked with a client who, or a couple who was either using a webcam or on a webcam as a model?
Um, I've worked with a model and I've worked with a number of men that use webcams. I've not yet ever worked with a woman that admitted to using webcams, but
Very interesting. And I think, like you said, this kind of ties back to some of what we talked on at the start of our call. Women haven't been given as much permission to explore their sexualities in various ways. They haven't been given as broad of
that and women are not as inclined to monetize sex. They don't want to pay for it, whereas men are more willing to pay, right? Because they're trained to. They pay for the dates. They're the ones that are dishing out the money when a man is courting a woman. So it's they're kind of trained for it, whereas women are not trained in that. And women get the message that if you're paying for it, it's bad, it's dirty, it's wrong. Or if you're being paid for it, it's bad, it's dirty, it's wrong, right? And so I think part of it is the permission, but also I think it's the money aspect. They feel like the money aspect makes it more dirty. And I've had women tell me, and I know this is true in Oklahoma, like for example, as a woman, if you go into a massage parlor and you want a happy ending, they will not give it to you. Even if it's a massage parlor that does give happy endings to men, they will not for women. There may also be just a lack of, what would the word be? Product for women, right? Like there's not as many male escorts, male strippers, male men on webcams. So if you're a woman and you're into women, you might be more inclined to use webcams because there's more women, right, as the models. But if you're a straight woman, most of them are just going to assume they won't even do the research. They're just assuming that there's no men out there that they could pay, right? Or if they did, it would be like really expensive and they don't see the value in it, or they might see the value in it but they're now telling themselves this is dirty and this is even more wrong than just hooking up, right? I'd rather hook up than do that. Take my chances with the hookup. Well, if you're just hooking up, you're probably not going to have the quality of the sex is not going to be that great, and most most likely.
No, I think you touched on some really interesting points that should probably be explored more, just in the sense of how things are being marketed or catered to women who are straight, for instance. I'm
It's
curious.
probably in the works of changing though, because if you look at it, like there's more and more companies that are geared towards, for example, making porn for women or making better sex toys for women, you know, um, or quite frankly, making better sex toys for men, even like some of these areas where it's been very limited in the past. I know that we are actually in a shift of changing that as a society because of my field, right? Like I recently did a class and, I got exposed to all of these new companies that have been created by sex therapists, sex coaches, sex educators, um, to bridge the gap in what's available for women and what's available for men, and trying to improve that communication, but also like improving, sex worker industry as a whole. And unfortunately, they consider sex therapists sex workers too. So I'll put myself in that category. But so it is changing and improving.
How long have you been a sex therapist?
For 10 years.
I want to ask you, in your 10 years of actually seeing clients, is there something that you've learned from dealing with people directly about human sexuality that really surprised you?
I will say that two things. one of the things that has really surprised me is the number of men who equally want and need emotional connection in order for them to perform sexually. And then the other thing that has surprised me is the vast number of people who have crippling anxiety around sexual performance, both men and women. Those things were surprising to me. And then also, like, I don't know why I was surprised by this because I experienced it growing up, but it has surprised me that my lack of feeling vulnerable in areas of talking about sex or expressing myself sexually, that can be a major turnoff to men and women. And that has surprised me. I really had to kind of learn how to kind of, I hate to say it this way, but at times I will censor myself or kind of decrease my enthusiasm as a way to not offend clients, because I've had female and male clients tell me that me being so open with my sexuality actually made them feel more insecure about their lack of openness. And so I've had to kind of adjust that without lying about who I am, right? So those things have been very surprising to me.
Very interesting. Okay. So you're saying that people feel uncomfortable when you talk openly about sex, basically.
Yeah.
Openly in from their perspective.
Right. And unfortunately, you don't know what somebody's going to find too open, right?
That's
until after you've already said it. So
yeah, that is subjective. We all have
right.
perspective.
So like recently, I was having a conversation with an acquaintance of mine. She's a pelvic floor physical therapist. And obviously, I'm a sex therapist and sex coach. And she's wanting me to teach her how to communicate about trauma and kind of do a little bit of like coaching while she's doing her physical therapy with clients, because she's getting a lot of trauma clients. And so I asked her, when you're working with a female, do you ever do pussy massage, which is the same thing as vulva massage or yoni massage, right? And she got, in her words, triggered because I used that language. And it, quite frankly, it really upset her that I had used that language. And she didn't feel like I used professional language. And I was like, well, I didn't feel like I needed to use professional language. We were sitting at my kitchen table drinking wine. And to me, the word pussy is just synonymous with yoni and vulva, right? So, it doesn't activate me in my system. But because of where she comes from, it did activate her. But I took that and I considered it because, when I'm working with my clients, I do have to remember that I'm in a conservative state. And so even though they may be coming to me because they want to learn to have an open relationship, or they want to learn BDSM, or they want to learn how to give sensual touch or whatever it is, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be comfortable with all of my language. And so when I'm working with people, I have to be mindful about trying to stick to more academic language, at least for the first like 6 sessions, until they get like comfortable with me. But more importantly, until they become more comfortable with themselves and talking about their own bodies and their own sexual expression and their history, right? So it was a good learning for me.
If you could give one message to everyone in the world about human sexuality, maybe something you think the world's just not getting that you wish they would, or yeah, anything.
I wish that the world would understand that every human being, every creature is a sexual creature, right? We all have sexuality in us. It is innate. There's no hiding from it, right? It's nothing to be ashamed of. It's part of our nature. Sexual energy is the same thing as just energy, right? Like you and I right now engaging in this conversation, we have a lot of energy between us. And that energy is the same energy as sexual energy. We're using the energy differently in this context, right? We're using it for communication. And if people could understand that, and if they could also understand that pleasure, play, fun, joy, that this is fuel for life and happiness, right? We as human beings, we need to be seeking pleasure as much as possible in order for us to feel happy, right? Which is why so many people seek sex, because when we have sex, especially if we have an orgasm with that sex, but even just engaging in touch, right? When we engage in a hug or we engage in sensual touch or orgasm, our body produces oxytocin and dopamine and a bunch of other healthy hormones, right? Which actually are good for our brain. It's good for our mental health, right? When we have more oxytocin and dopamine in our body, we have less anxiety, less depression. This is why so many people use sex as a coping mechanism for stress, which can be problematic, but it's not a problem in and of itself. It's actually a healthy coping mechanism when used, in moderation, like everything.
What do you think are the important next steps in moving forward with a more sexually well, healthy society?
Well, I think one of them is to decriminalize sex workers, for sure. And I also believe that we need to, as a nation or worldwide, we need to allow for a more positive sex education to be taking place in our schools. Because, if people could get information about the will of consent and about healthy touch and about being a full body yes versus saying yes out of fear or saying yes because I want him or her to love me, right? If people had more of this information in middle school and in high school, we would have a significant decrease in sexual assault. And we would also have a significant decrease in anxiety and depression and sexual dysfunctions as a whole. I don't know if there's any study to back that up, but I 100% believe that. All of my colleagues believe it. And I feel like the proof is in the pudding, because when you teach adults, they improve their interactions and their connections with themselves and others. So if you can teach it to adults, you can most certainly teach it to children.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.